She said, "I can't have children." The cowboy smiled. "Good. I've got enough kids for both." Wyoming Territory, 1886. The last light of summer stretched in across the valley, brushing gold over dust, sage, and memory. The wind moved easy between the fence rails, carrying the smell of horses, sweat, and hay. Carter's Creek ran low that year, dry enough to whisper but too shallow to drink from. Beyond it, the Bennett Ranch stood quiet, sturdy as the man who built it. Locals said if you listened close, you could hear laughter there, small laughter, the kind that used to come from children who'd forgotten how to cry. They also said that was where the quiet man lived, the one with all the little ones. Aunt Coyle stopped at the front gate, her gloved hands tightening on the strap of her satchel. She had traveled 2 days by stage, 1 day by wagon, and the last stretch on foot. The road had ended a mile back, fading into scrub. What lay ahead didn't look much like a schoolhouse, but then nothing had looked like home for her in years. Her dress was simple, dusted brown from travel. Her bonnet shadowed her face, but nothing could hide the exhaustion in her eyes or the faint, stubborn light that refused to go out behind them. She was 28 and carried herself like someone older, someone who had known grief long enough to stop fighting it and instead carry it gently, like an old ache you learn to live with. From the porch came the slow groan of hinges. The door opened. Colt Bennett stepped out. He was broad in the shoulders, his shirt sleeves rolled high, his forearms dusted with sweat and hayseed. His hair was sun-faded and a little too long, his jaw unshaven but clean of vanity. His eyes, gray-blue, steady, took her in the way a rancher measures the sky before a storm. Quietly, carefully, without hurry. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I was told you had children here. I came to offer lessons, reading, writing, numbers, if you'd allow it." He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "You ever had children of your own?" The question struck sharper than she expected. Her lips parted, then closed again. For a long moment she stood still, the sound of wind scraping against the barn filling the silence. Then she answered, calm but low. "I cannot have children," she said, "but I will raise them with the love of a mother if you'll let me." Colt's gaze didn't soften, not right away. But the longer he studied her, the more something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not surprise. Something simpler. Acceptance. A faint smile tugged the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said at last. "I've got enough kids for both." He motioned her forward, down the porch steps and across the yard. The sun caught the tin roof of the barn, flashing like a signal. Dust rose beneath their boots as they walked. "Eli," Cole called. A boy of about 10 turned from the corral fence, sharp-eyed and wiry. He had a look that said he didn't miss much. Beside him stood a smaller one, Finn, maybe 5, who tried to copy his brother's posture and nearly tripped doing it. Near the bucket, 2 girls played in the dirt. Nora, gentle-faced and serious, and tiny Lai, no more than 3, with a wooden doll missing both eyes. When they saw Aunt, they froze. Not out of fear, just a raw, wordless curiosity of children who'd learned not to expect strangers to stay. "They're beautiful," Aunt said quietly. Colt nodded once. "That they are." She hesitated. "They're all yours." His jaw shifted. He looked toward the barn, then back at her, close enough to call him mine. There was no apology in the words, no explanation, just a truth that needed none. The day waned. Colt led her through the house, not large, but built with care. Wooden floors worn smooth, walls smelling faintly of pine and bread. The parlor held a cracked leather chair, a Bible, and a shelf of books thick with dust. He showed her a small room beside the kitchen. The bed was narrow but clean. A lamp waited on the table, half full of oil. A half-finished child's shawl lay folded beside it. Soft blue yarn coiled around the needles. "Room's yours," Colt said simply. "Breakfast before dawn." "They rise early." She nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, and left her to unpack, and set her satchel down, fingers brushing the yarn. She imagined small hands that might have once touched it, then stopped herself. Hope was dangerous company. She had learned to keep it on a short leash. Still, as she stood at the window, she saw him across the yard carrying the little one, Lahi, in his arms. He tucked her into a cot near the barn window, brushed her hair aside, lingered a second too long before turning away, and whispered to herself, "If there's a father like that, no child need ever wonder who they are." The wind carried her words away into dusk. The next morning broke pale and gold, and woke to the smell of coffee and the low hiss of a kettle already boiling. Someone, Colt, she guessed, had left a bottle of milk warming beside the stove, wrapped in cloth. No note, no fuss. The children watched her at breakfast, curious, cautious. Nora whispered to Finn, who whispered to Lai, who just giggled and hid behind her spoon. Eli sat still, measuring her in silence, and didn't press. After years of trying too hard to be welcomed, she'd learned something important. Kindness doesn't demand attention. It just waits to be noticed. By noon, she had gathered them near the side yard. She smoothed out a patch of dirt with a stick, then drew the letter C. "This one," she said, "curves like a cat's tail." The children leaned closer. "S," she went on, "slithers like a snake." Finn laughed. Lai tried to hiss and nearly toppled over. By the third afternoon, they were tracing letters on their own. By the fourth, they were spelling their names. From the porch, Cole passed by once or twice. He didn't interrupt, didn't smile, but each time his boots slowed. Lai had a habit of wandering. Twice that week, and woke to the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs, small, unsteady. She found the child standing at the foot of the steps, eyes half closed, murmuring a song in a language no one taught her. The second night, and didn't wake Colt. She simply lifted Lai into her arms, whispering softly as she carried her back to bed. "Now," she said, "you're safe, sweetheart." The girl stirred, not waking, and her little hand curled around Anta's finger. It was such a small gesture, but it hit deep, a promise, unspoken. You stayed. On the fifth day, the sun sank red behind the hills, and stood by the pump, washing tin plates. The children chased each other through the tall grass, their laughter rising with the crickets. She turned toward the porch and paused. Colt sat there, head bowed, threading a needle through a torn sleeve. His fingers were thick, clumsy. He pricked himself once, muttered, and tried again. The shirt, she noticed, was Finn's, the green one, torn at the elbow. He looked up briefly, caught her eyes, then went back to his work. "He likes this one," he murmured, and smiled. "It suits him." He nodded, didn't smile, but the line of his jaw softened, just slightly. That night, she found herself humming as she trimmed the lamp. The sound surprised her. It had been a long time since she'd remembered how. Later, as the wind began to rise outside, and sat at her window with the shawl from the bedside in her lap, she'd added 3 rows of stitches since arriving, neat, careful ones. She looked out toward the barn, where a single lamp still burned. A tall shadow moved within. Colt, checking the horses before bed. For a moment, she thought how strange it was to feel safe here. Not because anyone promised it, just because they lived like the promise was already kept. She folded the shawl, set it on the chair, and whispered a small prayer she hadn't used in years. Not for herself, but for them all. Outside, the coyotes called far off, lonely, not hungry. The stars blinked over the valley like candles in a great dark church. And the Bennett Ranch, once a place whispered about in town as a house of orphans and pity, slept warm for the first time in a long while. She came to teach letters and left teaching something deeper. That love, when spoken softly, can still be heard louder than sorrow. Out on the plains, where the wind forgets names and graves fade quick, one woman found a gate that finally opened, and one man, to use a loss, found someone who didn't ask to leave. Morning came clear and sharp, the kind that wakes a place fully alive. Sunlight spilled through the parlor windows in long bars of gold, touching the dust that drifted like breath in the still air. The Bennett house smelled of coffee, soap, and the faint sweetness of apples drying on the stove, and had been there a week, long enough to know the creak in every floorboard, the whistle in the kettle, the sound of Colt's boots crossing the porch at dawn. She was beginning to move in rhythm with the place, not as a stranger anymore, but not yet as someone claimed. That morning, she gathered the children again by the south fence. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above them, and the ground shimmered faintly with heat. She drew a circle in the dirt with her stick. "This," she said, "is the start of every O, but it's also the shape of the sun. See how it begins and ends at the same place." Finn squinted at it. "So every letter's like the sun?" She smiled. "In a way. They all come back to where they start, if you're patient enough to follow them through." He grinned, proud of the thought. Nora rolled her eyes, pretending she wasn't impressed, but then caught the flicker of a smile before the girl turned away. Lahi sat in the dirt nearby, the doll in her lap, tracing invisible lines with her finger. "Lahi," and said gently, "what are you writing?" The little girl shrugged. "Just names," and nodded. "That's a good thing to write." When the lesson ended, Colt came by from a barn. He leaned against the fence, listening as the children recited the alphabet, their voices uneven but eager, and didn't notice him at first. She was kneeling beside Nora, helping her shape the letter M in the dust. Her hand covered the girl's small fingers, steadying them. Her voice was soft, rhythmic. When she did look up, she saw him watching, that same quiet, unreadable expression. She rose, brushing dust from her skirts. "They're learning," she said simply. He nodded. "I can see that." He hesitated, then added, "They like you." She smiled faintly. "Children like anyone who looks at them as if they matter." His gaze held hers a moment longer than usual. Then he pushed away from the fence, muttered something about the horses, and walked off toward the barn. That evening, supper was stew and bread, plain fare, but hearty. The children ate at the table, talking over one another in a jumble of stories and laughter. Colt sat at the head, silent but not distant, eyes moving from face to face like a man taking roll. Anth ate last, waiting until the children's bowls were filled. She took a small seat near the end, folded her hands over her napkin. Halfway through the meal, Finn asked, "Miss Coyle, did you ever shoot a snake?" Anth blinked. "Can't say I have." "Pa did," Eli said proudly. 3 summers ago, right by the creek." Colt gave a small grunt. "It was one snake." "Big one," Eli insisted. "Big enough," Colt said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. The children laughed. Anth watched the exchange quietly, a warmth rising in her chest that surprised her. It was the kind of laughter that didn't need to be earned, only shared. After dinner, she gathered the dishes, but Colt stood. "Leave, Em," he said. "You've done enough." She shook her head. "Work's never hurt me." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right then, but I'll dry." It was the first time they'd stood side by side, without words pressing between them. The sound of the dishwater and the wind against the shutters filled the silence. When their hands brushed once, his calloused, hers damp from soap, neither pulled away right away. Later that week, and found Nora sitting on the porch, legs swinging, face turned toward the hills. "Don't you get tired of them always running and shouting?" the girl asked. "Sometimes," and said, "but I think silence can be too loud if you have too much of it." Nora looked at her, serious. "Are you sad, Miss Coyle?" The question startled her. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like it sometimes. Like when you stop talking in the middle of a word." And smiled, touched and a little shaken. You're very observant, Nora. The girl shrugged. I just know what quiet people look like. And reached out, smoothing the child braid. Then you and I understand each other better than most. From the barn, Colt's hammer struck wood, rhythmic, steady. The sound rolled across the yard like a heartbeat. That night, the moon rode high and pale over the valley, and couldn't sleep. The children's soft breathing drifted through the thin walls, and somewhere a horse snorted in its stall. She rose, lit her lamp, and pulled her small wooden box from the trunk. Inside was a single silk ribbon, faded pink, the ends frayed. Clara, the name stitched in fine thread, trembled beneath her touch. She remembered a winter much like this one. Snow on the roof, fever on the child, the doctor coming too late, her husband leaving the next spring. Everything gone by the time the crocuses bloomed. She closed the box gently and whispered, I hope you know I never stopped loving you. Outside, the wind sighed through the cottonwoods, as if carrying her words somewhere they might be heard. By mid-afternoon the next day, the ranch buzzed with life. Colt and Eli were repairing the corral. Finn and Nora helped and gathered laundry from the line before the wind carried it off. When one sheet caught her across the face, she laughed, a sharp, surprised sound that made the children stop and grin. Go on, she said, folded before it flies to Cheyenne. From where he worked, Colt looked up. The laughter caught him off guard. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard a woman laugh on this land. Later, as the sun lowered, he came to the pump where she was scrubbing tin plates. You're not afraid of work, he said. She smiled. There's comfort in doing what keeps others well. He studied her hands. Strong, square, scarred faintly by years of doing exactly that. Then, almost without meaning to, he said, My wife, she couldn't stand it here. Said the silence pressed on her. Said the wind made her feel small. And paused, water dripping from her fingers. And what did you say? I said the wind was the only thing that ever listened. For a moment neither spoke. Then she said quietly, maybe she wasn't wrong. The wind can listen too long and still never answer. Colt's eyes lifted to hers. Two quiet people finally seeing how much the other understood. He nodded just once, then turned back toward the barn. Days turned into weeks, and fell into the life of the ranch without realizing it. Her mornings started with porridge and a row of sleepy faces. Her afternoons filled with chalk letters and berry-stained fingers. Each night she wrote in her small journal by lamplight. Eli learns quickly. Nora needs gentleness more than rules. Lahi sings in her sleep. Finn talks too much and not enough. Sometimes she'd add a line about Colt, nothing grand, just he listens when no one else does, even when he says nothing at all. One afternoon, the children were playing near the well. Eli dared Finn to climb the fence and reach the hanging pail. Before and could warn him, Finn slipped. She caught him before he hit the ground, just enough to turn the fall. The boy scraped his knee and burst into tears. Colt came running, breath sharp. What happened? Just a scare, she said. Nothing broken. He knelt beside Finn, examining the scrape like it was a bullet wound. You sure? Positive, she said gently. Then, noticing the way his hands shook, she added softly, You care for them like they were your own. He looked up. They are my own, just not the way the law would see it, and held his gaze. Then the law doesn't see right. Something shifted between them. Not love yet, but the first tremor of something real, like water finding the edge of frozen ground. That night, and sat by the fire, mending a tear in Finn's green shirt, the same one Colt had tried to sew days earlier. The children slept. The house was still. Colt entered quietly, a shadow in the lamplight. You're still up. Couldn't sleep, she said. I thought I'd finish what you started. He nodded, stepping closer. You sew better than I do. That's only because I've had more practice fixing things. He smiled, a small one, tired but genuine. For a man who'd forgotten how to smile, it looked like the first sunrise after a long winter. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her hands move. Then he said, almost to himself, "You're good with them, the children." She didn't look up. "They make it easy." "Not always." "No," she agreed. "Not always. But worth it." The fire crackled between them, the silence full and gentle. When she finally looked up, he was already watching her again. Not like a man watching a stranger, but like someone realizing he'd been looking at home for a very long time without knowing it. There are houses that stay cold no matter how many fires you light, and there are others that warm with every breath, every kindness. By the second month, the Bennett Ranch was no longer just a place where orphans slept. It was a home, because one woman knew that love doesn't come with bloodlines, and one man had finally stopped fearing the sound of another heart in his house. The wind changed that week. Came down colder from the ridge, the kind that warned summer was near its end. The grass turned from gold to pale brown, and the evenings carried the smell of frost and smoke. And had grown used to the rhythm of the Bennett place by then, the creak of the porch boards, the crack of a gate latch, the clatter of boots in the hallway. She knew the children's laughter by tone now, could tell from sound alone whether it was joy or trouble. But nothing, not all her watching, could have prepared her for the cry that split the afternoon sky. She was sorting books near the parlor window when it happened. A sharp shout, followed by a scream. By the time she reached the yard, Colt was already running from the barn. Nora lay at the foot of the paddock fence, clutching her arm, her face drained white with pain. The boy stood nearby, frozen in guilt and shock. Colt dropped to his knees beside her. "Don't move, honey, don't move," and knelt opposite him, her skirts sweeping the dust. "Let me see." The arm was bent wrong. Not shattered, but close enough to make her stomach twist. Nora's breath came in ragged sobs, teeth biting down hard on her lip. Colt's hands hovered, unsure, trembling in a way that startled her. The man who could handle a stampede suddenly looked lost before one small, broken limb. Anta's voice came calm, measured. 2 straight boards. Clean ones. Quick. Colt scrambled back to the fence, tore a slat free, broke it in 2, and returned, breathing hard, and tore her own apron into strips, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She laid the boards along the arm, tied them snug but gentle. "It'll hurt for a moment," she whispered. "But you're brave, Nora. You hear me? Brave." The girl nodded through tears, and kissed her brow once, steadying the child's trembling. "That's it. Breathe now. Good girl." When she looked up, Colt was watching her. The dust on his face streaked where sweat had mixed with something else, not panic now, but awe. "I've never seen someone who wasn't a mother," he said, voice low, "be so much like one," and didn't answer. She only brushed Nora's hair from her eyes and said softly, "The worst part's over. Let's get her inside." They carried the child to the spare bed and fetched cool water, Colt holding the bowl while she dampened the cloth. Nora whimpered as Aunt pressed it to her brow. "Try to rest," she murmured. "You'll feel better by morning." The girl's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing easing. Colt stood in the doorway, shoulders heavy, hat still in hand. He looked older somehow, like the moment had stripped something from him. "You did good," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I should have been watching closer." "You can't watch every fall," she said. "You can only be there to catch what's left." He met her eyes. For a long second, neither spoke. Then he nodded once and stepped out, boots creaking softly on the floorboards. That night, after the house went still, and sat alone in her room, the moonlight came through the window faint and cold. She reached for the small wooden box in her satchel, the one she never opened unless she had to. Her fingers hesitated on the lid, then lifted it. Inside lay a silk ribbon, pale pink edges frayed. Stitched with name, Clara. Her thumb traced the letters as memories flooded back. A child's laughter in a Boston parlor. Small feet against hardwood floors. The smell of lavender soap and winter fever. Her daughter had been 3 when the fever came. 3 and gone within the week. Her husband left before the year's end, unable to look her in the eyes. She'd left soon after, because there was nothing left to stay for. Now, years later, in a house full of other people's children, the ache of that loss had turned into something quieter but no less real, a steady emptiness that lived where joy should have been, and held the ribbon to her heart. For the first time, no tears came, only a long breath, steady and sure. She whispered, "You have liked him, Clara. You have liked him, too." A knock startled her. Soft, hesitant, she hid the box quickly, then called, "Come in." Colt stepped inside, hat in hand. The firelight from the kitchen flickered behind him, casting his face in half shadow. "She sleeping?" he asked, and nodded. "Finally. She'll be all right." He exhaled, relief softening the lines of his jaw. "You stayed up with her?" "I couldn't sleep if I didn't." Colt looked down, thumb rubbing the brim of his hat. "You remind me of my mother," he said quietly. "She didn't talk much either, but you always knew what she meant," and smiled faintly. "Then she must have been a good woman." "She was," he said, "hard on herself. Never anyone else." A silence fell, not heavy, but thoughtful. Finally, Anne spoke. "Do you ever think about what makes a family?" He looked at her, caught off guard. "Every day." And he took a slow breath. "Ain't blood. Ain't name. It's who you feed, who you fix, who you miss when they ain't in their chair." She looked at him then, really looked, and felt something in her chest move. It wasn't fast, wasn't sudden, just a quiet shift. "That's a good answer," she said softly. "I reckon it's the only one I got," he replied, then tipped his hat and left her to the night. When she closed the door, her hand lingered on the handle a little longer than it needed to, and dreamed that night, a dream she hadn't had in years. She was walking through tall grass, the wind bending it like waves. A little girl ran ahead, laughing, her ribbon streaming behind her like a banner. When she turned, it wasn't Clara at all, but Nora, healed and smiling. And behind her, the ranch stood whole and golden, full of life and sound. She woke before dawn, tears on her cheeks, but a lightness in her chest she couldn't name. Nora's fever broke by morning. The girl blinked up at the sunlight spilling through the curtains. "It hurts less," she whispered, and smiled. "That means you're healing." Colt appeared in the doorway with a mug of warm milk, the steam curling like smoke. He set it on the bedside table, his movements careful, reverent. "Guess she'll live," he said gruffly. Nora smiled weakly. "You worried, Pa?" "Maybe a little," he said. The word Pa hung in the air between them, and caught Colt's glance, that small flicker of surprise and emotion that passed through him like a ripple across still water. When he left the room, she followed. Outside the door, he stopped, bracing one hand against the wall. His voice was low, almost rough. "I didn't know she called me that." "She sees what you won't let yourself see," Anne said gently. He turned toward her then, eyes searching. "And what do you see, Miss Coyle?" She swallowed. "A man who's built something worth calling a home." His jaw tightened, as if he wanted to answer but didn't trust himself to. He only nodded once and walked toward the porch. Days passed. Nora healed and went back to lessons in the yard, the children back to laughter. But something had changed, a warmth under the quiet, a thread of understanding that tied her and Colt in ways neither had expected. Sometimes, at supper, she'd find his gaze already on her. When she looked up, sometimes, when she passed him bread, their hands would linger a second longer than they should. No words, no declarations, just a slow, steady knowing that grows between two people who have already seen too much of life to believe in easy things. One night, Colt found her sitting by the hearth, the shawl spread across her lap. The lamp was low, the room soft with golden light. "You keep busy even when you don't have to," he said. "It's easier than thinking," she replied. He chuckled, just once. "You and me both." He sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees. "I ever tell you how I found Eli?" She shook her head. There had been a barn fire up near Laramie. Rode past it 2 days after. Found him sitting in the ashes. Wouldn't talk. Wouldn't eat. Just sat there. Anta's breath caught. "How old?" 6, maybe 7. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "I brought him home. Figured he'd stay a week. That was 5 years ago." She said nothing, only looked at him. And for once, he didn't look away. "You've lost things, too," he said softly. Not a question. She nodded. "A little girl. 3 years old. Her name was Clara." He took that in quietly. No apology, no pity, just the kind of silence that holds meaning without breaking it. Finally, he said, "She'd have been proud of you," and blinked, caught off guard. "How could you know that?" He looked into the fire. "Because I am." When he left that night, he didn't close the door all the way. The lamplight from the hall fell across her lap, warm and golden. She sat still for a long while, hands resting over the shawl. Something new had settled inside her. Not happiness yet, but the soft ache of something on its way. Outside, the wind picked up. It ran through the pines and across the hills, carrying the faintest echo of a lullaby. Her own voice, days ago, soothing a frightened child. And through that same wind came another sound, barely there. Colt humming along from a barn. The tune was crooked and off-key, but it was the same one. And smiled not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Two hearts don't have to meet with thunder to know they've found each other. Sometimes they just meet in the still places. Over a broken arm, a mended sleeve, a ribbon folded in a box. She carried her grief like a secret. He carried his like a scar. But between them, love began to grow the way spring grows through thawed ground, quiet, patient, certain. Wyoming's late summer heat held too long that year. The air was heavy, dry as cotton, and the sky above the valley shimmered like glass. Even the horses grew restless in their stalls, and it started to feel at home in that stillness, days marked by laughter, the smell of bread in the oven, and the quiet rhythm of small hands learning to write. But peace, she was learning, never lasted long on the frontier. It was a Tuesday when the rider came. The sound of hooves rose first, slow, deliberate, too even to belong to a neighbor. Colt looked up from mending a harness, his jaw tightening as dust lifted beyond the gate. A man in a dark coat rode into the yard. His horse was government issue, his hat too clean for ranch country. He dismounted, boots hitting the earth with practiced authority. "Mr. Bennett," he called. Colt wiped his hands on a rag, walking forward. "That's right." The man reached into his saddlebag, withdrew a folded envelope sealed with red wax. "My name's Harris. I'm from the Territorial Welfare Office." Anth, hearing the tone, stepped onto the porch, her apron still dusted with flour. "There's been a complaint," Harris said flatly. "You've got 4 minors here, none by blood, none legally yours." Colt's expression didn't change, but his stance did, a subtle tightening, like a man readying for a blow. "They've got a roof, food, schooling," Colt said evenly. "What's the complaint?" "The complaint," Harris replied, "is that none of it's lawful. According to county record, these children have no registered guardian. In 10 days, we're to relocate them to Cheyenne Orphanage until matters settled." The air went still. Even the chickens by the barn stopped clucking. Anne took a step forward. "There must be a mistake. These children," Harris raised a hand. "Ma'am, I don't write the rules. I just carry them. He tipped his hat, mounted again, and rode off, leaving a trail of dust curling behind him like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. That evening, the house felt too quiet. The children sensed it. The way laughter stuck in their throats, the way Colt's voice dropped lower, the way Anta's hands trembled when she poured milk. After the little ones were in bed, she found Colt sitting on the porch, hat low, elbows on his knees. "They'll take them," he said, voice low. "You know they will." "Not if we stop them," she answered. He looked up, eyes hollow in the lamplight. "And how do you stop paper, Miss Coyle? How do you argue with ink? You fight it with truth," she said firmly. "You make them see what family looks like." Colt leaned back, the boards creaking beneath him. "You don't know these men. They don't care what a home feels like, only what it looks like on a ledger," and turned toward him, her voice rising quiet but fierce. "Then I'll make them care. If I have to write every preacher, doctor, and neighbor in this valley, I'll do it." He looked at her, really looked, at the determination burning behind those gray eyes. "Why?" he asked softly. She blinked. "Because they're ours. And because once someone took mine." The words hung between them like struck glass. Colt didn't speak again. But before dawn, when Aunt rose to light the stove, she found the ink pot, paper, and a small stack of envelopes already waiting on the table. For 3 nights, she wrote, by lamplight, by fatigue, by faith, to the pastor who'd baptized Nora, to the shopkeeper who'd traded feed for Colt's repairs, to every neighbor who'd ever heard a child's laughter from this ranch and smiled. Her words were simple, steady, and true. They call them orphans. But out here we call them family. What law can measure a father's hands or a mother's care? By week's end, replies began to come. Some were short, "He's a good man." Others long. Stories of Colt's quiet help, of children fed, fences mended, strangers sheltered. Each letter she tied in twine and placed in a box on the table. When the pile grew tall enough to hide her hands, she wept for the first time since arriving. Then the storm came. Thunder rolled low across the valley, black clouds swelling over the ridge. The wind rattled windows. Pried at shutters, tugged at the house like something alive. By nightfall, the rain was coming in sheets, and had lit every lantern she could find, their trembling light throwing long shadows across the walls. In the parlor, Lai lay on the settee, her cheeks flushed, her small body burning with fever. Colt stood in the doorway, boots dripping, face pale. "She was fine this morning," he said, and wrung the cloth over the basin. "It's sudden. She needs quinine or it'll turn worse. The doctor's in town." Colt said, "I can ride." She turned sharply. "The river's flooded, Colt. They said a freight wagon washed clean off the bridge last week." "I know," he said. His voice was calm, but under it ran steel. "But I know where he keeps a spare kit, in his shed near the depot. If I don't go now, she won't last till morning." "You'll drown," she said, rising halfway, the lamp flickering between them. "Or worse, get there and never make it back." He stepped closer, rainwater dripping from his coat. His hand rested briefly on Lai's small back, then on Anta's shoulder. "You can take care of all 4 better than I ever could," he said quietly. "But this part's mine to do." Her eyes filled. "Colt." He squeezed her hand, hard, and then was gone. The door slammed against the wind, and caught a flash of him in the lightning. Colt mounting the big gray gelding, oilskin tied tight, reins cutting through rain. The gate groaned open. Then he was swallowed whole by the night. Inside, time crawled and sponged Lai's forehead, whispering songs that blurred with tears. Eli paced the floor. Finn sat by the stairs, knees pulled tight to his chest. Nora hovered, biting her thumbnail raw. "Is Pa coming back?" Finn asked, voice small, and gathered him close, her voice trembling. "If it's for one of you," she said, He'd ride through anything. Hours dragged. The storm beat against the house, thunder shaking the windows. Lai's fever climbed, her breath short and shallow. And prayed. Not the practiced prayers of a church pew, but the desperate kind of whisper a woman makes when she's out of strength and out of answers. Then, hoofbeats, faint at first, then louder, and rushed to the door, throwing it open. The wind snatched her breath. And there he was, Colt, drenched, mud up to his knees, his face gray with exhaustion. Behind him rode another man, holding his hat tight against the gale, the doctor clutching his satchel. Colt stumbled in, half collapsing against the wall. "Got him," he gasped. "Got the kit, too," and caught his arm before he fell. "You're soaked through." "Don't matter," he managed, breath ragged. "She's still breathing, ain't she?" "She is," and whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "She is." By dawn, the fever had broken. The storm was gone, leaving behind a valley washed clean and silent. Lahi slept, pale but steady, her hand curled around the edge of Anta's shawl. The doctor packed his bag, gave quiet instructions, and left without charge. Colt sat slumped in the corner chair, boots still wet, coat half off, fast asleep. One hand rested loosely over his lap. The other, and noticed, hung open, a small blister forming where the rains had cut his palm. She covered it gently with her own hand and whispered, "You came back." He didn't wake, but his hand turned just slightly beneath hers, fingers closing around hers like instinct. A knock came mid-morning. Two men stood at the door, Harris again and a clerk beside him, both holding clean boots and colder eyes. Colt rose slowly, still pale, as Aunt met them at the threshold. "We received new word from the courthouse," Harris said. "Your petition's been reviewed. Community testimony came in strong." He hesitated, glancing at Aunt. That letter from Miss Coyle sealed it. He handed her a folded paper. "The removal order's rescinded, pending final approval." Anta's hands shook as she took it. "So they stay?" she asked. Harris nodded. "For now. Looks good for permanent." When they left, Finn darted from behind the door, eyes wide. "We're staying," and knelt, tears glinting in her lashes. "Yes, sweetheart. You're home." Behind her, Colt leaned against the wall, shoulders sagging in relief. For the first time, she saw him smile fully, tired, trembling, but real. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, in the scent of wet earth, in the way the porch boards creaked under bare feet. That night, and lit one lamp in the kitchen. Colt sat across from her, hands still bandaged. "I owe you more than I can say," he murmured. "You don't owe me," she said. "We both just did what love does." He looked up. "Love." She met his gaze without flinching. "Whatever you call what keeps us riding through storms." He held her eyes a long time, then said quietly, "Then I reckon I've been in love longer than I knew." Neither of them moved. The fire crackled low, the world hushed, and smiled, small and trembling. "Then maybe it's time you stopped being the only one." When the law came for what was theirs, they answered with courage. When death rode close, they met it with love. Some storms tear roofs apart. Others, they bind hearts tighter. That night, a man who never asked for help learned what grace looks like. And a woman who'd lost everything learned that family isn't given. It's fought for. The storm had passed, but it left its mark. The valley looked new in the pale light, washed clean, glistening like it had been reborn. The river ran thick and brown with silt, but the sky above it stretched wide and blue again, as if to say, "You made it." Inside the Bennett house, the world moved slower. The air smelled of wet wood and soup simmering. The fire in the hearth hissed softly. Still drying boots and coats hung on the rack. Lahi slept by the window, her breathing even now. Nora sat beside her, reading softly from a children's book, the pages wrinkled from damp hands. Finn and Eli helped Colt stack firewood, their boots thudding gently on the porch. Aunt watched them all from the kitchen, her hands resting on the back of a chair. There was a stillness of the scene that made her chest ache, the kind of peace people search for their whole lives and often miss when it's finally theirs. That afternoon, the post rider brought a new envelope. Stamped, sealed, official. Colt turned it over in his hands, brow furrowed, and dried her hands on her apron and stood beside him. "Do you want me to?" He handed it to her. "You read better than I do." She broke the seal carefully. The paper smelled of ink and courthouse dust. Her eyes scanned the words once, twice. Her breath caught. "It's done," she whispered. Colt straightened. "Done." She nodded, voice trembling. Legal guardianship confirmed. Colt Bennett, sole provider and protector. Aunt Coyle co-caretaker, responsible for education and well-being. He blinked, stunned. "That means, it means," she said softly, "they can't take them. Ever again." The children, hearing their names from the other room, came running. "What is it?" Eli asked, and knelt, opening her arms as they gathered close. "You're staying," she said through tears. "No more goodbyes. You're home for good." Nora gasped. Finn hooped, and little Lai, still pale but smiling, whispered, "Home." Colt stood behind them, one hand resting on Eli's shoulder. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of years in silence sat in his chest, finally lifting. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. They were safe. They were his. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window like honey. Anth woke late, a rare thing. The house was already alive with sound. Children whispering, dishes clinking, the low hum of a man's voice. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and noticed the smell first. Coffee, eggs, toast, though one of those smells was suspiciously burnt. When she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped short. Colt stood at the stove, apron slung crookedly around his waist, tried to flip pancakes that looked more like boot soles. Finn was at his elbow offering advice. He turned, startled but proud. "You weren't supposed to be up yet," and smiled, folding her arms. "And missed the show?" He grinned, sheepish. "Didn't mean to burn breakfast." "It's a fine effort," she said, picking up a plate of what she suspected were eggs. "And the effort's what counts." As she sat down, she noticed something folded beside her cup, a small note in Colt's square handwriting. "Everything you do for them today, let me do for you." Her breath caught. She pressed the note to her chest, then looked up. Colt was pretending not to watch, but his ears had gone red. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, not trusting his voice. The days that followed felt lighter, softer. The children ran freer across the fields. The laughter carried farther. Aunt and Colt fell into a rhythm, a partnership that needed no speaking. She cooked, he chopped wood. She taught the children. He repaired what broke. And between all that doing, they started being. Sometimes he'd bring her small things from the barn, a carved whistle, a polished stone, once a daisy tucked awkwardly behind his ear because Nora told him to bring Miss Coyle something nice. Sometimes she'd pack his lunch with a note folded inside, a single word or phrase. "Remember to eat. Proud of you. Stay dry." He never threw them away. At supper, she'd catch him glancing at her, just a flick of the eyes, soft, grateful. When she looked back, he'd look away too fast, pretend to scrape his plate. Neither of them said what was building between them. They didn't need to. The world around them spoke loud enough, in warmth, in laughter, in belonging. One evening, after the children were in bed, Colt stood out on the porch, watching the last light fade from the hills, and joined him, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. "They sleep easy these days," he said quietly. "They know they're safe," she replied. He nodded. "You did that." She shook her head. We did. He turned toward her then, the lamplight from inside catching his face. I don't talk much, you've noticed. I've noticed, she said with a small smile. I figure I ought to try, he said, voice lower now. After all this time. She waited. I don't remember what I prayed for back when life was rough. Maybe just for someone who'd see the good left in me. His gaze met hers. Turns out I was praying for you. Her breath caught. He took a step closer, hat in his hands, voice rough as gravel. You gave them back a mother. You gave me back a home. She blinked back tears. You gave me something too, Colt. You gave me purpose again. He nodded slowly, then said, almost a whisper, I want you to stay. I already am, she said softly. That night, and sat by the fire rocking Lai, who'd had another restless dream. Colt stood nearby, arms crossed loosely, watching the small rise and fall of the child's chest. When Aunt looked up, he met her eyes, and neither looked away this time. I'm not much for big words, he said, but I was thinking, if you were to stay longer, I think this place might become something good for all of us. For me, too. She didn't answer right away. Her hand found his, warm and rough, and it stayed there longer than a friendly touch should. Then maybe, she said quietly, we stop calling it staying. Maybe we call it home. He smiled, small, genuine. Home, he repeated. I like that word. A week later, frost came early. White clung to the fence rails, and the creek froze thin at its edges. Colt pulled the coats from storage, and Aunt mended mittens by the fire. They talked sometimes now about small things, the coming harvest, the stubborn rooster, the sound of coyotes at night. But beneath every word hummed something deeper, waiting to be said. It was a cold morning when Aunt didn't come down. Colt found her still in bed, cheeks flushed, not with fever, just sheer exhaustion. He touched her shoulder gently. You all right? She smiled faintly. Just tired. He frowned. Then rest. I'll take care of things. He meant it. The breakfast that morning was a disaster. Burnt toast, undercooked eggs, coffee so black it could have shined boots. But he served it all with pride. When Aunt woke and came downstairs, she found the children eating happily, proud of their pa's cooking. And there, beside her empty cup, was another note in Colt's handwriting. You don't have to do everything to be everything. She pressed it to her lips, laughter breaking through tears. That night, she stood by the fire again, brushing Lai's hair as the girl dozed. Colt was by the window, fixing a broken lantern, the glow catching the side of his face. You scared me, she said quietly, thinking of the storm, the ride, the days that almost ended differently. He looked up. I scared myself. She turned toward him, her voice trembling. I thought I'd lost you. He set the lantern down, crossing the floor in 2 slow steps. You didn't. I prayed, she whispered. I know. They stood close now, the space between them small enough to feel each other's breath. I've never had a place to come back to, he said. Not really. Not until you. Her throat tightened. And I never thought I could be chosen again. Not after losing my child. He reached for her hand, rough, warm, steady. You can't have children, he said softly, repeating her words from that first day. But you've been a mother in every way that matters. Her eyes shone. And you, Colt Bennett, have been a father in every way that counts. He smiled, the kind of smile that heals more than words ever could. Then I don't want you to teach them anymore. Her brow furrowed, uncertain. No, I want you to raise them with me, as their mother. She caught her breath, and as my wife. The fire popped once, a soft flare of light. She didn't speak, only nodded one trembling motion. Colt took her into his arms, careful, reverent. No fireworks, no crowd, just a hush of snow outside, and the sound of 2 hearts finding home. Love doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it walks through the door with muddy boots and a quiet smile. He thought he'd lost everything that could be loved. She thought she'd lost the right to love again. But in one house, after one storm, they both learned this truth. Family isn't found. It's made. Winter loosened its hold at last. Snow melted into silver threads that ran down the hills, and the earth, long asleep, began to breathe again. The first crocuses pressed up through the mud near the porch steps. The valley's cold hush gave way to birdsong. At the Bennett Ranch, the world moved with purpose. Fences mended, roofs patched, seeds ready for the field. The children ran through thawing grass, cheeks pink with cold, laughter carrying far. And in the evenings, when the lamps burned low and the air smelled faintly of pine smoke and baking bread, there was peace. Colt and it lived now as if they'd always belonged in the same story. He still rose early, quiet as dawn. She still hummed when she worked. But between them was a softness new to both, the ease of being known and still wanted. One morning, Colt stood at the kitchen table, coat half-buttoned, his hat in hand. "Going to town," he said. "Need supplies." And looked up from kneading dough. "Be careful. The road's still slick by the ridge." He nodded, hesitated, then reached into his pocket and set something small on the table. A plain gold ring, smooth, unadorned, glinting faintly in the morning light. "I couldn't find one finer," he said simply. "Didn't think you'd need finer." And froze, her hand still dusted with flour. "Colt," he smiled faintly, "you already said yes by staying." She swallowed hard. "Then I'll keep saying yes by staying still." He chuckled softly, kissed her forehead. The first time he dared to touch her like that, and left before she could cry. When the door shut, she pressed the ring to her heart, flower and all. Spring came bright and full. The air smelled of wet grass, lilac, and promise. The valley glowed green again, and the wind had lost its bite. Neighbors came from miles around that day, ranchers, townsfolk, even the preacher who'd once doubted their little family. They arrived carrying pies, baskets, ribbons, their faces soft with joy. Out beneath the old oak tree behind the house, 2 rows of chairs waited. A table stood at the front. On it, 2 tin cups filled with lilac, a loaf of bread, and a pair of simple copper bands hammered smooth by the blacksmith in town. And stood inside, the children fussing around her. Nora pinned a sprig of lilac in her hair. Lai held her hand tight, beaming with pride. Eli stood straight, already taller than the year before. Finn tried to look serious, but couldn't stop grinning. Her dress was cream white, plain but lovely, the hem brushing the grass. She'd sewn it herself from the same fabric she'd once used to mend the children's shirts. It fit like a story, one she'd never dared to believe she'd live. Outside, Colt waited beneath the oak, boots polished, vest pressed. He looked at once nervous and steady, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The sunlight made his hair shine gold at the edges. When Aunt stepped out, the crowd hushed. The children led her down the aisle, Eli on one side, Finn on the other, Nora and Lai behind them carrying ribbons and wildflowers. She reached him, and they stood facing each other beneath branches heavy with new leaves. The preacher cleared his throat. "We gather not for grandeur, but for grace," he said. 2 people choosing freely and fully to stay. He looked at Colt. "You got something to say, son?" Colt nodded, turning to Aunt. His voice was low but sure. "I can't promise you riches. I can't promise easy days. But I can promise this. Every morning you wake, you'll know you're needed here, wanted here, loved here." He paused, his eyes softening. "You once told me you couldn't give life, but you did. Every laugh, every word in this house, that's life you gave us. You made this place breathe again." And swallowed hard, tears bright in her eyes. She took his rough hands in hers. "And you," she said quietly, "showed me love doesn't end when we lose it once. It waits. Patient, kind. I didn't think I'd ever belong again, but you gave me that. You gave me them. You gave me home. For a moment, no one breathed. Even the birds went still. Then Colt slipped a copper band onto her finger, his hands trembling just enough to make her smile. The preacher closed his Bible. By grace and choice, husband and wife. A cheer rose, soft laughter, quiet tears. Finn hooped loudest of all, and Nora shushed him through happy sobs. Colt kissed her, gentle and sure, and the wind carried the sound like a secret across the hills. The feast was simple: bread, stew, cider. The neighbors lingered long after the sun began to sink. Someone played a fiddle, children danced in the grass, and laughter drifted up to the oak branches. And sat for a moment at the edge of the yard, watching. The glow from the lanterns flickered on the faces she'd come to love, each one marked by work, weather, and wonder. Colt joined her, setting 2 tin cups on the step. Never figured I'd have a day like this. Neither did I, she said softly. He looked at her, eyes crinkling. Reckon we'll make a fine mess of growing old. She smiled. Together, at least. Weeks passed. The oak tree, once bare, now offered shade to a dozen children. Not just theirs anymore, but the neighbors too, and taught lessons under its branches. A chalkboard propped between 2 barrels, letters smudged by wind and laughter. Mothers brought baskets of eggs and soap and thanks. The children's voices rose like bird song across the field. Colt worked nearby, mending a saddle, watching her when he thought she didn't notice. Sometimes she'd look up and catch him smiling. Sometimes he'd wink and go back to work. Life was simple now, but it wasn't small. It was full. One evening, and sat on the porch with a book in her lap. Lai napped beside her, dog curled against her chest. Finn and Nora rolled marbles across the boards. In the distance, Eli was helping Colt tighten a new bridle, their quiet voices mingling with the creak of leather and the hum of crickets. The light was soft golden, that perfect hush before night, and closed her eyes and whispered, I used to think my life had ended. Turns out it was just waiting to begin again. Colt glanced up, hearing her voice though not her words. He smiled faintly. You say something? She looked over, eyes warm, just counting blessings. He nodded. You'll run out of daylight before you finish. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from peace. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag, and walked over. You know, he said, lowering himself beside her, this old house used to echo. Now it breathes. She took his hand, fingers threading through his. That's what love does, Colt. It teaches walls to breathe. He looked out over the land, the hills fading blue in the distance. You're not just their mother, he said quietly. You're the mother of this whole home. Her eyes filled, but she didn't speak. Because sometimes the best way to say, I love you, is to stay silent and hold on. Seasons turned. The children grew. Eli took over the herd, tall and sure. Nora learned the fiddle and played by the firelight. Finn built birdhouses that hung in every tree. Lahi, still sleepwalking sometimes, would wake under the oak and say she'd been talking to the stars. Ant and Colt watched them all, side by side, the years etching fine lines around their eyes, but never dulling the light there. The Bennett Ranch became known not just as a working place, but a welcoming one. Travelers stopped for water and left with food. No one went hungry if Colt or Ant could help it. Their love wasn't loud. It was built in the small things, the steady warmth of hands meeting, the quiet comfort of knowing someone was waiting at the window when you rode home. Some loves burn quick and bright and fade before winter. Others burn low and steady, warming every season after. In a land known for loss, they built something that lasted, not through luck, not through blood, but through choice. The teacher who couldn't bear children, the cowboy who had too many to count. Together, They made a family that would outlive both their names. And if you ever ride through Carter Valley on a spring evening, you might still hear laughter under the oak, the sound of a house that learned how to breathe.